Imagine walking through the narrow, winding streets of a medieval city. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, the chatter of merchants, and the distant ringing of church bells. But beneath all of that, the bustle, the markets, the sound of iron on anvils, there is something every person depends on, though it often goes unnoticed: water. Without it, no city could survive. Yet in an age before taps, pipes, and modern plumbing, finding and securing water was a daily challenge. Wells had to be dug, rivers had to be fetched from, and entire systems of fountains, conduits, and aqueducts had to be maintained, all to keep life flowing in these crowded and growing urban centers. The way medieval people found, carried, and used water tells us not only about their survival, but about their ingenuity, their fears, and even their faith. In this video, we'll explore in detail how people got water in medieval cities, from the humble village well to the grand aqueducts that fed entire towns. We'll see how water shaped daily life, public spaces, and even beliefs about health and purity. And we'll uncover the forgotten roles of those who carried and managed this most essential resource, often unseen but always indispensable. Before we dive in, I invite you to subscribe to *History for Sleep*, where we bring the past to life in a calm, steady rhythm perfect for winding down at the end of the day. If you find yourself listening at night, or even in the middle of a restless hour, drop a comment and let us know when you tune in. Share what moments in history you'd love to hear about next. Your ideas help guide where we travel together in time. Now, settle in, let your breathing slow, and prepare to drift back to a world where water was both a daily struggle and a constant companion. Let's begin our journey into the medieval city, where every drop mattered. Every medieval city, no matter how grand or how humble, owed its very existence to water. Long before walls were raised, before markets bustled, and before cathedrals reached skyward, the choice of where to place a settlement almost always began with the presence of a water source. A river, a spring, or a natural well determined whether people could endure the hardships of life in a place. Without water, fields would wither, animals would perish, and human life could not be sustained. In many ways, water was the silent architect of medieval urban life, shaping where people built, how they lived, and how far a city could grow. Imagine the traveler arriving at the gates of a medieval city after days of journeying across dusty roads or muddy paths. What greeted them, aside from the looming walls and the watchful eyes of guards, was often the murmur of water streams running beneath, bridges, fountains in the squares, and the constant presence of water carriers moving through the streets with their heavy loads. This lifeblood flowed invisibly through the routines of the inhabitants. From the baker mixing dough before dawn, to the laundress scrubbing clothes by the riverbank, to the monks chanting in cloisters beside carefully channeled streams, every activity was bound to water. In this sense, it was more than a resource. It was the quiet force that connected every person in the city, rich or poor, noble or servant. Yet, though water was essential, it was never guaranteed. In many places, water had to be fought for, carefully guarded, and cleverly stored. A medieval city might rise because of a nearby river, but that river could flood, or worse, bring sickness when polluted. Wells could be dug deep into the earth, but in times of siege, they could be poisoned by enemies or run dry if overdrawn. Rainwater could be gathered, but drought could stretch for months, leaving barrels empty and tempers frayed. It is easy to think of water as abundant, but for the people of the Middle Ages, every bucket was a prize, every clean cup a blessing, and every wasted drop a small tragedy. The centrality of water can be seen in the very structure of medieval towns. In smaller villages, the well was often placed in the square, close to the church and market, symbolizing how vital it was to both body and spirit. In larger cities, public fountains served not just as places to draw water, but as gathering points where neighbors exchanged news, merchants haggled, and children played. The sound of water splashing from spouts and basins became part of the city's daily music, a rhythm as steady as the tolling of bells. Even castles, those symbols of strength and dominance, had to be planned around water sources, for no fortress could stand if it lacked reliable access to fresh supplies. The importance of water also seeped into the imagination and faith of the people. Water was not only practical, it was sacred. It was tied to baptism, cleansing the soul just as it cleansed the body. Priests sprinkled holy water to bless homes and drive away evil. Pilgrims sought out holy springs, believing in their power to cure illness or offer spiritual renewal. Thus, the everyday act of drawing water became layered with meaning. A simple bucket pulled from a well could be more than sustenance. It could symbolize life, purity, and connection to the divine. For people whose lives were filled with uncertainty, from sudden plagues to unpredictable harvests, the reassurance of water was a kind of stability, a reminder that life still flowed on. But water also revealed divisions. The wealthy could afford private wells or pay water carriers to bring them clean supplies directly to their homes, while the poor stood in line at crowded public fountains or walked long distances to rivers that were often polluted by waste. In this way, water mirrored the social hierarchies of the city. Those with influence had more control over access, while those without had to make do with what they could find. This tension could even lead to disputes, with fights breaking out over who had rights to a particular source, or who was drawing more than their fair share. For a commodity so simple and necessary, water could inspire both cooperation and conflict, generosity and jealousy. When we think of medieval life today, it is often the castles, the knights, or the markets that come to mind. Yet beneath all of those images lies the constant presence of water, the quiet, invisible foundation of daily existence. Without it, the baker could not bake, the brewer could not brew, the smith could not cool his iron, and the sick could not be tended. Without it, cities would have collapsed, armies would have faltered, and trade would have withered. Water was not only the lifeblood of individuals, but of entire communities. To truly understand medieval life, we must begin here, at the well, the river, and the fountain, where survival began every single day. As we continue this journey, keep in mind that every step through the medieval city is also a step closer to water. Every sound of footsteps on cobblestones, every creak of wooden buckets, every shout in the marketplace, all of it is connected to this one element, flowing quietly through history, sustaining a world both fragile and enduring. If one were to walk into the center of a medieval village or city, it would not take long before coming upon a well. Sometimes it stood in the middle of a square, framed by a simple wooden beam or a sturdy stone circle. Other times it was built with decorative arches or even protective roofs, a sign of its importance to the life of the community. The well was not just a place to draw water, it was the very heart of daily existence, as vital as the church or the marketplace, and in many ways just as symbolic. Every person, no matter their station, would at some point in their day or week make the journey to the well, carrying buckets, jars, or simple clay vessels, ready to collect the water that sustained their household. The process of building a well was itself an act of tremendous labor and ingenuity. Digging deep into the earth without the benefit of modern drilling machinery required skill, endurance, and no small amount of risk. Workers lowered themselves into narrow shafts, carving steadily through soil, clay, and rock, often with little more than picks, shovels, and sheer determination. Sometimes the digging went so deep that timber supports had to be lowered to prevent cave-ins. When water was finally struck, it was celebrated with joy, for the well promised not just a resource, but survival for generations to come. Once lined with stone and equipped with a rope and pulley, the well became a permanent feature of the community, a gift from one generation to the next. The well was also a place of gathering. It was where women met in the morning to draw water for cooking and washing, where children followed their mothers to learn the daily tasks of managing a household, and where neighbors exchanged gossip, news, and advice. In villages with only one or two wells, it became an unspoken rule that the well was the social heart of the community. To linger too long was expected, for conversation was as much a part of the ritual as the act of filling a bucket. Many travelers, when writing about medieval towns, noted that the well was where the pulse of local life could be felt most strongly, where laughter, quarrels, and whispered secrets mingled in the air. Yet wells were also a matter of trust and care. A well could be easily fouled by carelessness or malice. To drop waste, dirt, or anything unclean into the water was not only an insult, but an endangerment to the entire community. For this reason, rules were often set about how close waste pits or animal pens could be to wells, and penalties could be severe for those who polluted them. In times of war, poisoning a city's wells was considered a cruel but effective tactic, cutting off a supply more essential than bread or grain. The knowledge that one's well could be corrupted instilled in people a sense of constant vigilance, a reminder that water was precious and must be protected at all costs. Drawing water from a well was a task that may seem simple to us, but in reality, it was a daily test of endurance. A full wooden bucket could weigh more than 30 pounds, and carrying it home often required balancing the load across long, uneven streets or pathways. Many families relied on children or hired helpers to bring water in sufficient quantity, while others made multiple trips each day. In larger cities, this demand for labor gave rise to the profession of water carriers, men and women whose lives were spent hauling water from wells to households for a fee. The act of pulling the rope, feeling the resistance as the bucket rose from the dark shaft, and hearing the splash as another vessel descended became a rhythm woven into the life of the city. Some wells became legendary in their own right, not merely for their depth or abundance, but for the stories that grew around them. Folk tales spoke of wells that never ran dry, said to be blessed by saints or guarded by spirits. Others whispered of cursed wells, places where misfortune seemed to strike those who drank from them. In Christian tradition, wells often carried spiritual weight, linked to holy figures or miracles. Pilgrims would travel to drink from certain wells believed to cure illness or provide divine favor, blending the practical necessity of water with the mystical hope of healing and salvation. Even in ordinary times, wells were blessed during ceremonies, and priests were sometimes called to purify them after suspected contamination, reflecting a deep connection between faith and the daily act of drawing water. In cities, wells were often placed strategically to serve different neighborhoods, ensuring that no one had to walk too far. Some were shallow, tapping into natural springs, while others descended to dizzying depths to reach underground reservoirs. The deeper the well, the more difficult the task of maintaining it. Ropes would fray, pulleys would creak, and stone linings could collapse under pressure. Skilled craftsmen were called upon to repair these vital structures, often risking their lives in the process. For the people who depended on them, these wells were treasures worth protecting with care and devotion. The well also became a symbol of generosity and community spirit. In many medieval towns, wealthy families or rulers would fund the construction of a public well as an act of charity, a gift that ensured their legacy long after their deaths. These benefactors were often remembered with inscriptions carved into the stone, or with prayers spoken at the well in gratitude for their provision. In this way, water not only sustained the body, but tied communities together across generations, linking the living with those who had come before. But there were darker moments too. During droughts, when water levels dropped and wells yielded only trickles, desperation could turn neighbors into rivals. Families might quarrel over whose turn it was to draw, or accuse others of hoarding more than they needed. In such times, the well became a place not of fellowship, but of tension, where the balance between survival and scarcity was painfully clear. The well, usually a place of life, became a mirror of fear and fragility, when its waters receded. For medieval people, the well was more than a hole in the ground. It was a lifeline, a gathering place, a symbol, and a source of endless stories. When we picture these communities today, it is tempting to imagine their streets, their walls, their markets, but without the well, none of these things could have existed. To walk into the heart of a medieval town was to hear the creak of rope, the splash of water, and the chatter of neighbors gathered around this most ancient and essential of structures. It was here that life began each morning and ended each evening, at the well that held the lifeblood of the community. The act of drawing water may sound simple today, a task solved by turning a tap and letting water flow without effort. But in the medieval city, the daily ritual of fetching water from a well, river, or fountain was one of the most physically demanding and time-consuming chores of the household. It was a ritual that tied every person to the unseen depths beneath their feet, a moment when the necessities of life were quite literally lifted hand over hand from the earth itself. Buckets creaked, ropes groaned, and arms ached with repetition. Yet for centuries, this was the steady rhythm that sustained entire communities. To picture the scene, imagine standing at the edge of a stone-lined well in the town square. The morning sun is rising, and already a small line has formed, buckets in hand. The well is equipped with a simple wooden frame and a thick rope, the kind worn smooth from countless pulls. At its end hangs a bucket made of oak staves bound with iron bands, its weight felt even before it has touched the water. One by one, the townsfolk take their turn, lowering the vessel into the darkness below. The rope hisses through calloused hands. The bucket disappears into shadow, and then comes the splash, the sound that means the task is half done. Slowly, carefully, the bucket is drawn upward, the rope biting into palms, the weight increasing as water clings to the vessel. When at last the bucket surfaces, dripping and full, it is emptied into a wading jug or carried home, to be used sparingly until the next trip. For many, this was not a once-a-day routine, but a constant cycle. Water was needed for cooking, brewing, washing, and watering animals. A family could not rely on a single bucket to last long. Several trips were often necessary, sometimes made by children sent on errands, their small hands struggling to hold the handles of sloshing pails. Women, who bore the brunt of domestic labor, carried heavy jugs balanced against their hips or supported on their heads with cloth pads for cushioning. The sight of figures walking steadily down narrow lanes with water containers in hand was as common as the tolling of the church bell. The burden of water was felt in shoulders and backs, shaping the posture and endurance of those who lived by its constant demand. Buckets themselves were prized possessions. Crafted by coopers, they had to be watertight, durable, and able to withstand years of use. Iron hoops reinforced the wooden slats, while handles were often made of sturdy metal or thick rope. A leaking bucket was more than an inconvenience. It was a hazard, wasting precious water and forcing the user to repeat the arduous task of hauling more. Families sometimes passed down well-made buckets as heirlooms, a simple but meaningful reminder of the daily struggle and resilience of life. Wealthier households might own multiple vessels, while poorer ones relied on a single bucket that had to serve every need. Ropes were just as critical. A frayed rope could snap under the weight of a full bucket, sending it crashing into the depths, lost forever. To lose a bucket was to lose an investment of both money and labor, and it often left a family scrambling to borrow from neighbors until they could afford a replacement. Rope makers therefore supplied communities with strong, twisted hemp cords, thick enough to endure constant strain. The rope was more than a tool. It was a lifeline connecting the world above to the water hidden below. In larger cities, where fountains replaced some of the work of wells, the task was no less demanding. People crowded around spouts, filling their vessels as the water trickled steadily from carved stone faces or ornate metal pipes. Here, too, there was a rhythm of waiting, bending, and lifting, repeated endlessly each day. Public fountains may have been more decorative than simple wells, but the labor of carrying water remained. In fact, for many poorer families who lived on the upper floors of crowded tenements, carrying water up steep staircases was perhaps the hardest part of the task. Each trip from fountain to home was followed by another climb, the weight dragging at weary arms and legs. The chore of drawing water shaped the social fabric of the city. It was a time when neighbors crossed paths, when friendships formed in the patient waiting by the well, and when small disputes could flare over whose turn it was to draw next. In villages, children learned responsibility through the task, gaining strength and patience as they grew. In towns, water carriers emerged to take on the burden for others, transforming what had once been a household duty into a profession. Yet, even with carriers, the image of families making their way to wells and fountains endured, a scene repeated daily across Europe for centuries. The soundscape of water drawing was its own music. The creak of pulleys, the hiss of rope sliding against stone, the groan of wood as buckets rose, and the splashing of spilled water on cobblestones. These were familiar noises that told of life unfolding. At night, when streets grew quiet, one might still hear the faint echo of a bucket being lowered for a late errand, a reminder that water was a constant need, never confined to the daylight hours. The physical toll of this labor cannot be understated. Modern observers often underestimate how exhausting the daily struggle for water could be. Hauling gallons upon gallons each day meant sore muscles, worn joints, and fatigue that settled deep into the body. For women already tasked with cooking, weaving, child-rearing, and tending animals, the weight of water was yet another burden carried silently. For children, it was a responsibility that taught resilience, but also robbed them of ease. For men, particularly those engaged in heavy trades, it was one more demand added to long hours of toil. The act of pulling, carrying, and storing water-shaped bodies and lives in ways we can scarcely imagine today. Yet there was also a kind of rhythm and pride in the task. Water was not merely drawn. It was claimed from the earth, wrestled upward from the dark, and brought home with determination. To have one's buckets filled was to know that the household could continue, bread could be baked, ale brewed, wounds washed, and thirst quenched. The satisfaction of carrying a full vessel home was more than relief. It was accomplishment, the proof of endurance in the face of necessity. When we look back at medieval life, the great events of kings, battles, and cathedrals often overshadow the simple, repetitive acts that made survival possible. But it was in these daily labors, the lifting of buckets, the steady pulling of ropes, the aching steps of carrying water, that the heartbeat of the city truly resided. Each drop carried was a reminder of the fragile balance between need and provision, between scarcity and sufficiency. In every medieval street, behind every door, this quiet ritual was performed countless times, binding generations together in the shared struggle to lift life itself from the depths below. As medieval cities grew larger and more crowded, wells alone could no longer serve the needs of the people. The steady flow of life bakers needing water for dough, brewers for ale, dyers for cloth, and families for every meal demanded something more than a rope and a bucket. Out of this necessity, public fountains emerged, not only as practical solutions, but as striking features of the urban landscape. These fountains became the gathering places of towns, blending the essential task of fetching water with the social rhythms of community life. Unlike the quiet seclusion of a private well, fountains were designed to serve many at once. Often fed by aqueducts, underground conduits, or carefully engineered channels, they allowed water to flow continuously into basins, troughs, or carved stone bowls. People could line up, place their jugs or buckets beneath the spout, and collect what they needed without lowering a vessel deep into the earth. The sound of water flowing freely in such a setting was both practical and soothing, a reminder that the city had managed to tame and harness one of nature's most vital resources. The design of these fountains varied widely. In small towns, they might be little more than a spout projecting from a stone wall, feeding into a basin carved from a single block. In grander cities, they could be works of art, adorned with carvings of saints, animals, or fantastical creatures, their faces forever pouring water into the waiting hands of townsfolk. Some fountains were roofed, offering shade to those who came to draw water beneath the hot sun. Others were open air, serving as open invitations for people to gather, talk, and linger. No matter their form, fountains quickly became landmarks, places everyone knew and relied upon daily. The fountain was not just a place to fill vessels. It was where the city spoke to itself. Here, neighbors shared stories, merchants passed on news of distant markets, and travelers overheard the latest rumors of war, famine, or harvests. For women especially, who bore much of the responsibility for collecting water, the fountain was a rare social outlet, a place to meet others beyond the threshold of their homes. Children, too, found entertainment in these spaces, splashing hands in the basins, chasing each other among the crowd, and watching the steady, mesmerizing stream. In the evenings, when the day's work wound down, the fountain still drew people to its side, its steady flow continuing as darkness fell. The presence of fountains also reshaped the work of water carriers. Instead of hauling buckets from wells, many now filled their barrels at public spouts, then trudged through the city delivering water directly to households. The profession was no less exhausting, but fountains made their labor more efficient, allowing them to collect greater quantities more quickly. These carriers became familiar figures, moving with practiced steps through the streets, their calls announcing their arrival. For those who could not or would not make the daily trips themselves, a water carrier was as essential as the fountain itself. Yet fountains, like wells, required vigilance and care. Their channels could clog with silt, their basins could become fouled with waste, and their steady flow could dwindle in times of drought. City authorities often appointed keepers to maintain them, ensuring the water ran clean and abundant. Fines and punishments were established for those who misused or dirtied these communal treasures. For to contaminate a fountain was to imperil not only oneself, but the entire neighborhood. In this way, fountains embodied both the generosity of shared resource and the fragility of dependence, demanding cooperation and respect from all who drank from them. The symbolism of fountains reached beyond utility. Flowing water was a potent image in medieval thought, associated with abundance, renewal, and even divine grace. A well-tended fountain was a sign of prosperity, a mark that the city could provide for its people. In religious art and sermons, fountains often stood as metaphors for spiritual nourishment, the living water that cleansed the soul. When placed in prominent squares near churches or town halls, they reminded citizens that water was both a civic duty and a divine gift. Some fountains even doubled as charitable sites, where the wealthy endowed perpetual flows so that the poor would never go thirsty. In these acts, practical need and spiritual generosity intertwined. To the senses, a fountain added texture to the city's life. The sound of running water contrasted with the clang of blacksmiths, the cries of merchants, and the toll of bells. It softened the hardness of stone streets and timber buildings, offering a hint of nature within the built environment. The coolness of water was welcome on hot summer days, and in winter, when streams froze, a fountain that still flowed seemed almost miraculous. It was not uncommon for townsfolk to pause beside one, simply to watch the endless motion, a small comfort in a world often marked by hardship. In times of celebration, fountains sometimes became stages of spectacle. Chronicles tell of rulers ordering fountains to pour wine instead of water during festivals, a gesture of wealth and generosity meant to awe the populace. Though brief, such moments reinforced the fountain's role as a center of civic life, a place where necessity and joy could mingle. At other times, fountains were decorated with flowers or candles during processions, linking them to the cycle of religious festivals and public ceremonies. Yet the fountain also revealed divisions within society. Not all neighborhoods had equal access to them, and the placement of new fountains often followed lines of wealth and influence. The poor, crowded into the outskirts, might still rely on distant wells or polluted streams, while the central squares enjoyed the abundance of flowing water. Access to fountains became a quiet marker of privilege, another reminder that even a resource as essential as water was not equally shared. Despite these differences, the fountain stood as a constant presence in the lives of medieval people. Whether humble or ornate, it was a place where survival and community converged. To stand at its edge, to hear the endless trickle, and to carry away a vessel filled with its flow, was to participate in the unbroken chain of daily life. For centuries, fountains anchored the rhythm of the city, their waters reflecting not only the faces of those who gathered, but the spirit of a community bound together by its most essential need. Long before the invention of pumps and pipes that bring water to our homes today, medieval cities had to solve the puzzle of moving water from where it was abundant to where it was needed. Rivers, springs, and reservoirs might lie far from the crowded heart of a town, yet the bakers, brewers, tanners, and ordinary families living there all depended on steady access. Wells and fountains could only do so much, especially as populations grew. Out of this challenge emerged some of the most ingenious feats of medieval engineering: aqueducts and water conduits, systems that quietly threaded beneath or above the landscape to keep cities alive. The word aqueduct often conjures images of the vast stone bridges of ancient Rome, arches marching across valleys to deliver water across miles. Though medieval builders inherited the ruins of such marvels, their own efforts were often humbler, hidden beneath the ground rather than soaring overhead. In many parts of Europe, engineers built networks of clay or lead pipes, wooden channels, or stone-lined tunnels to carry water from springs in the hills to fountains in town squares. The principle was simple: let gravity do the work. If a source was higher than the city, the water could flow downhill naturally, guided by careful planning and endless labor. One of the most remarkable examples was found in medieval London, where in the 13th century, conduits were constructed to bring fresh water from the Tiber and springs several miles outside the city. These conduits, made of lead pipes encased in stone, carried water into central reservoirs and public fountains. Londoners marveled at the convenience of water flowing steadily into the heart of the city, a sign that even a bustling, smoky, crowded metropolis could tame nature to its service. Other cities across Europe followed similar paths. Paris drew from distant springs. Siena channeled water into its magnificent public fountains, and German towns cut channels through hillsides to guide streams into their streets. Building such systems was no easy feat. Surveyors had to measure land carefully to ensure the correct slope too steep, and the water would rush dangerously, eroding its channels. Too shallow, and it might stagnate or fail to move at all. Digging trenches and laying pipes demanded enormous labor, often with little recognition for the workers, whose sweat brought life into the city. Wooden pipes had to be hollowed from tree trunks, fitted end to end, while stone channels required skilled masons to carve and seal joints. Every link in the chain had to be secure, for a single crack could cause leaks that wasted precious water or contaminated the flow. Maintenance was just as demanding as construction. Leaves, silt, and debris could clog channels, while freezing winters could split pipes. Cities appointed inspectors, known in some places as conduit wardens, whose job was to monitor and repair the systems. Their work was constant, for without them the steady flow could falter, plunging neighborhoods back into scarcity. To ensure funding, some towns imposed special taxes or required wealthy guilds to contribute to the upkeep. In this way, water systems became part of civic pride and responsibility, a shared project that demanded cooperation from rulers, workers, and ordinary citizens alike. The arrival of aqueduct-fed fountains transformed urban life. Suddenly, Water did not have to be drawn laboriously from deep wells, but could be collected from a spout, flowing almost as if by magic. For the wealthy, private pipes could sometimes be arranged, allowing water to flow directly into courtyards or gardens. Though rare and expensive, such privileges symbolized status, a visible reminder that not all citizens were equal in their access. Still, even the poorest benefited indirectly, for public fountains relieved pressure on crowded wells and provided more opportunities to gather the daily supply. Aqueducts also fed more than households. They supplied monasteries, where monks used water for cooking, brewing, and bathing, often designing intricate systems that reflected both practicality and devotion. They supplied bathhouses, where townsfolk could wash, relax, and socialize, sustaining an important part of urban culture. They supplied industries dyeing cloth, tanning hides, brewing ale, all of which required copious amounts of water. In this way, aqueducts became the hidden engines of economic life, quietly enabling crafts and trades that defined a city's prosperity. There was also a spiritual dimension. Flowing water, brought into the city through hidden channels, seemed to echo the idea of divine providence, life-giving, constant, and mysterious. When fountains gushed, people sometimes viewed them as blessings, gifts made possible not just by human hands, but by God's will. Religious processions often paused at fountains fed by aqueducts, acknowledging them as symbols of abundance and grace. In Siena, for instance, the beautiful font Gaia, or Fountain of Joy, became a centerpiece of civic and spiritual life, its waters drawn through miles of carefully built conduits. Yet these systems were fragile. Siege warfare often targeted aqueducts, for an enemy who cut off a city's water supply could weaken its defenders without lifting a sword. Droughts, too, could dry up the springs that fed them, turning once bountiful fountains into empty basins. Repairs were costly and time-consuming, requiring expertise that was not always readily available. In this way, aqueducts were both marvels of human ingenuity and reminders of human vulnerability, proof that even the greatest efforts to master water could be undone by nature or war. To stand in a medieval city and see water flowing freely from a fountain was to witness the triumph of persistence, labor, and ingenuity over scarcity. It was a quiet miracle made possible by countless hands, from surveyors who measured slopes with simple tools to laborers who dug trenches in the cold, from masons who sealed joints with care to wardens who patrolled the conduits. Each drop that spilled into a basin carried with it the memory of that effort, the silent collaboration of an entire community. Aqueducts remind us that medieval life was not only about hardship, but also about creativity. They show us that even in centuries often painted as dark or primitive, people found ways to solve problems with resourcefulness and determination. Water was not just endured but mastered, guided through stone and wood to sustain the life of cities. In the steady trickle of aqueduct-fed fountains, we hear the ingenuity of the Middle Ages, a rhythm of survival and progress, flowing quietly beneath the noise of history. Not every medieval household could rely on a nearby well or a public fountain. For many families, especially those living in crowded towns or in areas where water was scarce, the sky itself became a vital source. Rainwater harvesting was a common and necessary practice, turning rooftops, barrels, and simple channels into lifelines that could mean the difference between comfort and hardship. While it might seem primitive compared to flowing aqueducts or deep wells, the quiet act of catching rainwater was one of the most practical solutions to the endless demand for water. Imagine a medieval home with its steeply pitched roof, shingles made of wood or slate, or sometimes thatch. When the rain came, whether a sudden summer storm or a slow autumn drizzle, it did not fall wasted. Gutters and spouts, often carved from wood or fashioned from simple stone troughs, carried the water downward into waiting vessels. These vessels might be barrels made by coopers, sealed tight with pitch to keep them from leaking, or clay jars large enough to hold several days' supply. Positioned strategically, these containers filled drop by drop, transforming the weather's gift into a household store of precious liquid. For many families, these barrels were not luxuries, but necessities. Wells could be far away, and public fountains were often crowded. A barrel of rainwater meant fewer journeys through muddy streets or long waits in line. It was especially valuable for tasks that consumed large amounts of water, such as washing clothes, scrubbing floors, or watering small gardens. Drinking water was often still fetched from wells or fountains when possible, since rainwater could be tainted by dirt from roofs or the air itself. But for most daily chores, rain barrels provided a reliable and convenient alternative. The storage of this water was as important as its collection. A poorly maintained barrel could breed insects, mold, or foul odors, rendering the water useless. Families learned to cover their containers with cloth, wood lids, or even stones to keep out debris and pests. Some would draw from the top while leaving sediment to settle at the bottom, a simple form of filtration practiced long before modern science explained its principles. In this way, even without sophisticated knowledge, medieval households developed practical strategies for keeping their rainwater as clean and usable as possible. Rainwater harvesting also carried a rhythm of anticipation and relief. In times of drought, when skies remained stubbornly clear, families watched the heavens with anxious eyes, their barrels standing empty in the courtyards. The first patter of raindrops on a roof after weeks of dryness was more than just a change in weather. It was salvation, the promise that buckets would be filled again, that daily life could continue with less strain. Children might be sent running to position extra vessels, their laughter mixing with the sound of rain, as the family rejoiced in the replenishment of their stores. For wealthier households, rainwater storage was sometimes more elaborate. Large cisterns, often built underground, could hold significant reserves fed by carefully designed gutters and channels. These cisterns, lined with stone or plaster, kept water cool and relatively fresh, safe from evaporation and contamination. In castles and monasteries, such storage systems were essential, providing reserves that could last through sieges or dry seasons. The building of a cistern was an investment of time and resources, but for those who could afford it, the security it offered was priceless. Rainwater also served symbolic and ritual roles. Water from the heavens was often seen as pure, untainted by the earth below, a direct gift from God. Some communities used rainwater in religious ceremonies, believing it carried a spiritual quality distinct from well or river water. In folklore, the first rain of May was sometimes thought to have special properties, capable of bringing good health or luck if caught and used. These beliefs added layers of meaning to what was, at its core, a simple act of practicality, catching what nature provided. Despite its benefits, rainwater was never fully reliable. Seasons varied, storms came unpredictably, and in some years, barrels might sit empty more often than full. This uncertainty meant that rainwater was rarely a household's only source, but rather one part of a larger strategy of survival. Families combined what they could harvest from the sky with what they could carry from wells, fountains, or rivers, balancing their needs against the limitations of each source. In this way, the rain barrel stood as a quiet complement to the louder, more public systems of urban water supply. The practice of harvesting rainwater also shaped the appearance of medieval homes and courtyards. Barrels stood in corners, jars lined against walls, gutters angled to direct every possible drop into storage. To visitors, these vessels were as common a sight as the smoke rising from chimneys or the wood stacked for winter fires. They were silent witnesses to the rhythm of life, filling slowly in the rain, waiting patiently in the sun, and emptying just as steadily with each day's work. There was, too, a communal aspect. Neighbors might share water in times of need, lending from one family's store when another's ran dry. A sudden storm could be cause for small celebrations, as households rushed to make the most of it together. In such moments, rainwater was not only a practical gift, but a shared blessing, knitting people together in gratitude for the heavens' bounty. In the larger picture of medieval urban life, rainwater harvesting may seem humble compared to grand aqueducts or ornate fountains, yet its importance should not be underestimated. For countless families, it was the difference between ease and struggle, between spending hours walking for water and finding it ready at hand. It was an act of foresight, patience, and quiet resilience, a reminder that survival was built not only on great feats of engineering, but on small, steady practices repeated in every courtyard across the centuries. The rain barrel and the cistern tell us something profound about medieval life. They remind us that people of the past were attentive to their environment, resourceful in the face of limits, and grateful for the gifts nature provided. In the steady drip of rain into a vessel, they heard not only the sound of water, but the sound of life itself, falling from the sky to sustain their world. If wells and fountains were the carefully managed veins of a medieval city, rivers and streams were its untamed arteries, flowing with both promise and peril. Many cities were born along riverbanks, their founders drawn by the steady supply of fresh water, the ease of transportation, and the fertile soils that rivers nourished. A river offered abundance: water for drinking, irrigation for crops, power for mills, and pathways for trade. Yet at the same time, it carried hidden dangers: pollution, disease, flooding, and the ever-present risk of over-reliance on a source that could turn hostile without warning. To picture the role of a river, imagine standing on a medieval bridge, its arches spanning the flowing current. Below, women wash clothes on flat stones, beating fabric against the water to drive out dirt. Just upstream, fishermen cast nets, hoping to bring in enough for the market. A little further along, water wheels turn steadily, driving the gears of mills that grind grain into flour. Horses are led into the shallows to drink, and children splash along the edges, their laughter mingling with the river's murmur. Life gathers at the banks, cold by the river's ceaseless motion. For a city, the river was both resource and stage. Barges carried timber, wool, salt, and grain along its currents, linking urban centers with distant markets. Merchants depended on the river not just for water, but for profit, their fortunes floating on its surface. Soldiers, too, used rivers as lines of defense, natural barriers that slowed invaders and gave strength to city walls. In every way, the river was a companion, shaping the growth, prosperity, and security of the communities that leaned upon it. But rivers were not easily tamed. With no modern sanitation, waste often found its way into the current. Tanneries dumped the foul remains of hides, dye workshops poured in colored runoff, and households emptied chamber pots directly into the water. What was drawn upstream as fresh and clean often became, downstream, a hazardous brew. People did not always recognize the link between contaminated water and disease, but they could not ignore the outbreaks that seemed to follow in the wake of pollution. Fevers, dysentery, and worse spread silently, carried by the same waters that nourished the city. In this way, rivers embodied the paradox of medieval life, sustaining and endangering in equal measure. Flooding was another constant fear. Heavy rains or melting snows could swell rivers beyond their banks, sweeping away homes, bridges, and fields in hours. Entire harvests could be lost, leaving famine in their wake. In some chronicles, floods are described almost as living monsters, devouring the streets and carrying off livestock and people alike. Cities built along rivers always carried this risk, and yet the promise of water and trade was so great that they accepted the danger as part of life. Embankments and levees were sometimes constructed, but they could only do so much against nature's force. After each flood, communities rebuilt, sweeping mud from their homes and repairing bridges, resigned to the cycle that tied them forever to the river. Still, the river's blessings outweighed its dangers. For many, it was the cheapest and most accessible source of water. Not every family could afford the fees of water carriers, and not every neighborhood had a nearby well or fountain. For these households, the riverbank was a daily destination. Children carried buckets, women filled jugs, and men led animals to drink. The river was open to all, a common resource that transcended wealth and privilege, though not without conflict. Rights of access were often disputed, with guilds or landowners claiming sections of the river for their exclusive use. In some cities, laws were written to regulate who could draw water, where washing could take place, and how much could be taken without penalty. Rivers also shaped the imagination and faith of medieval people. They were seen as sacred places, embodiments of creation's power. Saints were said to perform miracles at riverbanks, and holy men retreated to their shores for contemplation. In baptism, rivers symbolized spiritual cleansing, echoing the biblical Jordan where Christ was baptized. Folklore told of spirits dwelling in the depths, guardians or tempters, who could bless or curse those who approached unwisely. Children were warned not to linger near dangerous currents, lest the water spirit drag them beneath. These stories reflected both reverence and fear, a recognition that rivers were beyond full human control. On quiet days, rivers gave comfort. The steady murmur of flowing water provided a backdrop to life, a sound as familiar as birdsong or the tolling of bells. Farmers relied on the river's rhythm to irrigate their fields. Craftsmen harnessed its power to turn wheels, and households counted on it to quench thirst and wash away dirt. In times of plenty, rivers seemed eternal, their waters always replenished, their currents always flowing. In times of hardship, they seemed fickle, running low in drought or raging high in flood. Either way, the river was never ignored, never absent from thought, for it was too deeply woven into the fabric of survival. To stand on a medieval riverbank was to feel both gratitude and caution. The water flowing past was life itself, carrying sustenance and opportunity, yet always whispering reminders of its power to harm. Cities thrived on rivers, but they also suffered by them, bound in a relationship of dependence and vulnerability. In every bucket drawn, every bridge built, every mill turned by its current, the river shaped medieval existence. It was both blessing and danger, a force that defined the daily reality of life in the Middle Ages. Behind every cup of water poured in a medieval home, behind every pot boiled or floor scrubbed, there was often a pair of weary shoulders carrying the weight of the city's lifeblood. These were the water carriers, the men and women who earned their living by hauling water from wells, fountains, and rivers to households that could not or would not fetch it themselves. They were the hidden workforce of cities, indispensable, yet often overlooked, their lives bound to a labor as repetitive as it was essential. Imagine the early hours of dawn in a medieval town. The streets are still dim, the air heavy with the smell of damp stone and smoke from last night's fires. A water carrier begins the day's work, balancing two heavy buckets suspended from a wooden yoke across the shoulders. Each step is measured, steady, for the sloshing weight threatens to spill with any careless movement. The carrier moves from fountain to doorway, delivering water to households that have paid for the service. Wealthier families, merchants, and artisans often relied on these deliveries, sparing themselves the effort of daily trips to crowded public sources. For them, convenience came at a cost. For the carrier, it meant hours of backbreaking work. The profession of water carrying was widespread across medieval Europe. In cities such as Paris, London, and Florence, water carriers formed a visible part of the urban landscape. Some worked independently, striking bargains directly with households. Others were organized into guilds or associations, recognized by city authorities as essential tradesmen. These guilds regulated prices, set standards of service, and sometimes provided mutual aid in times of hardship. The work, however, remained physically punishing. The loads were heavy, the distances long, and the pay modest. Few grew rich from carrying water, but many survived on the small coins exchanged for each delivery. The tools of the trade were simple but vital. The wooden yoke, resting across the shoulders, distributed the strain of the buckets, allowing carriers to move larger quantities at once. Buckets were made of wood or leather, reinforced to prevent leaks, and often marked with distinctive symbols so that carriers could identify their own among the crowds at fountains. Some carriers used barrels mounted on carts, pulled by hand or with the help of animals, to supply larger customers such as bathhouses, breweries, or taverns. These innovations lightened the burden somewhat, but the core of the job remained the same, moving water day after day with muscle and endurance. Water carriers occupied a curious position in the social order. They were indispensable, yet their work was often viewed as lowly, a task for those with few other opportunities. Many carriers were migrants to cities, drawn from rural villages in search of work, or widows and poor men seeking a livelihood when other trades were close to them. Despite the hardship, the job offered a kind of independence. A carrier could choose customers, set routes, and work at their own pace, so long as they met the needs of those who paid. In this sense, the profession carried both freedom and burden, a delicate balance of survival. The life of a water carrier was not without its dangers. The weight of the buckets strained muscles and joints, leaving many with chronic injuries. Slippery streets, uneven cobblestones, and crowded markets turned every journey into a test of balance. A stumble could mean not only spilled water, but broken buckets, a costly loss for someone with little to spare. In winter, icy roads increased the risk of falls, while in summer, the heat made the work even more exhausting. Yet despite these challenges, carriers pressed on, for the city could not do without them. Their presence also shaped the rhythms of urban life. In the mornings, households waited eagerly for the day's deliveries, while in the evenings, bathhouses and taverns required larger supplies to meet demand. Festivals and feast days increased business, as more water was needed for cooking, brewing, and washing. During times of drought, or when wells failed, water carriers became even more vital, their services sometimes commanding higher prices as desperation grew. In this way, they were not merely laborers, but barometers of the city's needs, their work reflecting the ebb and flow of urban survival. Though often overlooked in chronicles and records, water carriers left traces of their presence in laws, ordinances, and even art. Some medieval manuscripts depict figures bent beneath the weight of buckets, anonymous yet representative of a profession that touched every household. City regulations mentioned the fees they could charge, the fountains they could draw from, and the times they were permitted to work. In some places, disputes arose between carriers and guilds, or between carriers and city officials, over access to water sources. These conflicts remind us that even something as basic as hauling water was entangled with questions of authority, economy, and survival. The dignity of the water carrier lay not in wealth or status, but in necessity. Without them, countless households would have struggled to meet their daily needs. Their steps, repeated endlessly through the streets, were as vital to the city as function as the tolling of bells or the turning of mill wheels. They were the silent thread connecting public fountains to private homes, ensuring that water so essential, yet so heavy, reached every corner of the city. To reflect on the water carrier is to recognize the hidden labors that sustained medieval life. History often remembers kings, knights, and builders of cathedrals, but it was the bent figures of water carriers, trudging patiently beneath their loads, who kept the ordinary rhythm of survival alive. Each drop they delivered was a testament to endurance, resilience, and the quiet heroism of those who labored not for glory, but for the simple continuation of daily life. When we think of the Middle Ages, images of dirt and filth often come to mind, as though people of that era lived without care for cleanliness. Yet the reality was far more nuanced. Water played an essential role, not only in survival, but also in hygiene and health. Bathhouses, riverside washing, and even private tubs in wealthier homes created a culture of bathing and cleansing that demanded enormous amounts of water. This constant need made water one of the most sought-after and carefully managed resources in every city. Public bathhouses were common across Europe, inspired partly by the lingering memory of Roman traditions and partly by necessity in crowded urban spaces. These establishments ranged from modest wooden structures with simple tubs to grand complexes with multiple rooms, heated pools, and even spaces for relaxation and conversation. For the people who visited, the bathhouse was more than a place to wash. It was a center of community life, where neighbors met, gossip was exchanged, and weary bodies found a measure of comfort. To fill these baths, however, required vast quantities of water, hauled by carriers or fed by aqueducts, making them some of the city's largest consumers. Inside a bathhouse, the ritual of cleansing was both practical and social. Patrons undressed, leaving their clothes in guarded chambers, and moved into warm rooms where steam softened skin and loosened dirt. Attendants poured water heated over fires, filling tubs and buckets for scrubbing. Soap, often made from animal fat and lye, was used to wash away grime, though its harshness could sting the skin. Others preferred to rub with oils, which were then scraped away with curved metal tools called strigils. The experience could last hours, and in that time, water was constantly in motion, poured, splashed, and refreshed in cycles that demanded steady replenishment from outside sources. For many, bathhouses were affordable luxuries, their prices low enough to attract artisans, merchants, and even laborers. Wealthier citizens could afford private bathing facilities within their homes, often in the form of large wooden tubs set in chambers where servants carried in hot and cold water. In castles and monasteries, special bath chambers were built, sometimes with channels to bring in fresh supplies directly. Yet whether public or private, the act of bathing was always tied to the availability of water. A bath meant that someone somewhere had labored to fetch and heat countless buckets, feeding the constant appetite of the tub. Cleanliness was not merely about comfort. Medieval thought often connected physical purity with spiritual or moral well-being. Monks bathed regularly, following rules of hygiene set down in monastic orders, believing that caring for the body aided in prayer and work. Pilgrims sought out baths at holy sites, hoping that washing in sacred waters might cleanse both body and soul. Physicians recommended bathing as a remedy for certain ailments, though they also warned against excess, fearing that too much heat or soaking might weaken the body. In this way, water's role in cleanliness carried both practical and symbolic weight, shaping how people understood their health and their place in the world. Yet bathing was not without controversy. Some moralists warned against the dangers of public bathhouses, which could become places of temptation, indulgence, or disease. In times of plague, authorities sometimes shut them down, fearing that the gathering of many bodies in steamy chambers might spread infection. Still, the popularity of baths endured, for the need to wash, to rest, and to find comfort outweighed fears for many. In some towns, bathhouses remained in operation for centuries, sustained by the constant flow of water carried through their doors. The demand for water extended beyond the act of bathing itself. Laundry, too, consumed enormous amounts. Women carried baskets of clothes to riversides or communal washhouses, where long hours were spent scrubbing, rinsing, and wringing garments. Soap, ash, and even clay were used to cleanse fabrics, all of which required steady rinsing in water. The sound of splashing and the sight of garments spread out to dry became familiar parts of urban life, reminders of how deeply water was interwoven with daily survival. For every tunic, cloak, or sheet that hung in the breeze, buckets of water had been lifted, carried, and poured. The very notion of cleanliness extended into the spiritual realm as well. Baptism, the most universal of Christian sacraments, used water as the symbol of rebirth and purity. To be washed in baptismal water was to begin life anew, and this sacred act reinforced the everyday importance of water in people's minds. Each bath, each washing of hands, echoed if faintly the larger idea that water had the power to cleanse not only the body, but the soul. In a world filled with hardship and uncertainty, this belief lent deeper meaning to the simple act of bathing. Still, not everyone had equal access to the comfort of regular bathing. The poor often made do with washing in rivers or carrying small quantities of water home for limited use. Bathhouses, though affordable to many, were not free, and in times of poverty or scarcity, families might forego them altogether. For these households, cleanliness was a harder struggle, and water became a treasure spent with careful thought. The contrast between those who could bathe in relative abundance and those who could only wash sparingly reflected the broader inequalities of medieval society. The constant demand for water in bathing, laundry, and cleanliness reveals how much effort went into maintaining even the simplest standards of daily life. Each bath taken, each garment washed, represented hours of labor by carriers, drawers, and household members. It also reflected the ingenuity of those who built aqueducts, cisterns, and washhouses, ensuring that communities could continue their routines. Water was never just there. It was always fetched, stored, managed, and valued. To consider the medieval bathhouse is to glimpse a world where water shaped not only health, but also community, faith, and leisure. It was where people came together, where bodies were refreshed, where spirits were lifted, and where the city's hidden workforce labored tirelessly to make it possible. Every splash in a tub, every rinsed garment, every drop poured onto weary skin was part of a cycle that bound medieval people to their rivers, wells, and fountains. It was a cycle that never ended, a constant demand that defined the very rhythm of urban life. While townspeople relied on wells, fountains, and rivers to meet their daily needs, the nobility faced a challenge that was both similar and uniquely pressing: how to secure water within the stone walls of their castles. A castle was not only a residence, but also a fortress designed to withstand attack, protect its inhabitants, and project strength. Yet no wall, no matter how thick, could defend against thirst. Without reliable access to water, the most imposing stronghold could be reduced to vulnerability in a matter of days. For this reason, the provision of water was one of the most critical considerations in castle design and daily life. At the simplest level, many castles relied on wells dug deep within their walls. These wells, often reaching far into the earth, were feats of engineering in their own right. Digging them was a monumental task, requiring workers to lower themselves into narrow shafts, chiseling away rock and soil with primitive tools. The deeper the well, the greater the risk of collapse, suffocation, or injury, but the reward was immense: a source of water safe from outside attack. In some castles, wells descended more than 100 feet, hidden in courtyards or even inside towers, ensuring that defenders could draw water without exposing themselves to danger. Some castles were fortunate enough to be built near natural springs, which could be channeled directly into cisterns or storage chambers within the walls. Others made use of rainwater harvesting on a grand scale, directing water from roofs and courtyards into vast underground tanks lined with stone and sealed with mortar. These cisterns, kept cool and dark, could hold large reserves, providing a buffer against drought or siege. In dry seasons or during prolonged blockades, such reserves could mean the difference between survival and surrender. Aqueducts, too, sometimes played a role in supplying castles, though these systems were more vulnerable. Channels or pipes brought water from nearby hillsides, feeding into courtyards or fountains within the fortress. While convenient in times of peace, such conduits could easily be cut by besieging armies, leaving defenders desperate. For this reason, castles rarely relied solely on aqueducts, preferring to combine them with wells and cisterns to ensure redundancy. The more sources of water available, the stronger the castle's chances of withstanding hardship. Within the castle walls, water served multiple purposes beyond drinking. Kitchens required steady supplies for cooking and brewing. Chapels used water for ritual and blessing. Gardens within the courtyards needed irrigation to provide herbs, vegetables, and medicinal plants. Bathing, though less frequent among the nobility than modern standards might expect, was still practiced, often in private chambers where servants hauled water in tubs and heated it with fire. In this way, the castle's water system sustained not only survival, but also the comforts and privileges that distinguished noble life from the struggles of common townsfolk. The need for water was most urgent in times of siege. Attackers often sought to cut off supplies, knowing that thirst could weaken defenders faster than hunger or sword. Chronicles tell of armies poisoning wells, diverting streams, or simply waiting for cisterns to run dry. Defenders, in turn, guarded their wells fiercely, hiding their locations or disguising them within the architecture. Some castles boasted secret passages leading to rivers or springs outside the walls, allowing stealthy access even under blockade. These passages, known as posterns or sallyports, were dangerous to use, but could sustain a besieged garrison long enough to endure. In the daily life of the castle, the labor of managing water often fell to servants and retainers. They hauled buckets from wells, maintained cisterns, and ensured that kitchens, baths, and animals were supplied. The nobility may have enjoyed the luxury of fountains in their courtyards or private tubs in their chambers, but these comforts rested on the shoulders of countless unseen workers. To carry water up winding staircases, across courtyards, and into kitchens was no small feat, yet it was done day after day, as essential to the castle's survival as its guards or masons. Symbolism also played a part. Fountains and ornamental basins within castles were not only practical, but statements of wealth and power. To display water flowing freely in a fortress was to show mastery over a resource that was often scarce and hard-won. In some places, decorative fountains were fed by aqueducts or pumps, their streams serving as reminders that the lord of the castle commanded not only land and people, but even the hidden lifeblood of the earth itself. Such displays carried a message as potent as any wall or tower: abundance within, even when scarcity reigned without. Yet for all the engineering and planning, castles remained vulnerable. Wells could run dry, cisterns could become polluted, and aqueducts could be severed. In the end, no fortress was stronger than its water supply. Behind every banquet, every council, and every feast in the great hall lay the silent, ever-present need for buckets of clear water drawn for the earth. The grandeur of castles may capture our imagination today, but their survival depended on something far more humble: the steady, ceaseless labor of ensuring that water flowed where it was needed most. To walk through the ruins of a medieval castle today is to see walls, towers, and battlements rising against the sky. Yet if you look closely, you will also find the remnants of wells, cisterns, and channels carved into stone. These are the quiet traces of the most essential resource of all, reminders that behind the power and pageantry of the nobility lay the same daily truth faced by every villager and townsman. Without water, life could not endure. Among the many institutions of the medieval world, monasteries stood apart as places of prayer, learning, and order. But behind the cloisters and chants, monks also faced the same earthly challenges as everyone else. They needed water. Yet unlike townsfolk who hurried to wells and fountains in the bustle of the city, monastic communities developed their own systems, blending ingenuity with discipline to ensure a steady supply. These water systems not only sustained daily needs, but also reflected the spiritual ideals of the monks, who sought cleanliness, order, and harmony with creation. Monasteries were often built with care when it came to location, and water was one of the most important factors in choosing a site. Many were placed near rivers or springs, ensuring access to fresh supplies. Others relied on the construction of channels and conduits to bring water from distant sources. For Cistercians in particular, who favored remote valleys and wilderness, the challenge of securing water inspired remarkable feats of engineering. They carved channels through hillsides, diverted streams, and built reservoirs, transforming lonely landscapes into centers of both spiritual and practical abundance. Within the walls, water was carefully managed and directed. Cloisters often contained fountains or washing troughs, allowing monks to cleanse themselves before entering the church or refectory. In some monasteries, elaborate systems of pipes carried water directly into kitchens, breweries, and latrines. The Benedictine rule emphasized cleanliness, not for vanity, but for health and discipline, and water was central to this practice. Monks washed their hands before meals, bathed periodically, and laundered their simple garments, all of which required a steady flow that could not be left to chance. Brewing and baking, staples of monastic life, demanded vast quantities of water. Monks brewed ale not only for their own consumption, but often for pilgrims and guests, making it a constant task. Mills powered by water wheels ground their grain, feeding the community and surrounding villages. Gardens, too, relied on irrigation, for monasteries cultivated herbs for medicine, vegetables for the table, and flowers for devotion. In this way, water sustained the body of the monastic community as surely as prayer sustained its soul. Latrines presented another challenge, one that monasteries solved with a practicality that often outstripped nearby towns. Many monastic complexes built sophisticated waste systems, with running water directed beneath communal latrines to carry waste away. This not only improved hygiene, but reduced the spread of disease, making monasteries some of the cleanest institutions of their time. Visitors often marveled at the orderliness of monastic life, and water played no small part in that impression. Where towns struggled with overflowing cesspits and fouled streets, monasteries offered an example of how thoughtful planning could transform daily existence. Water also held a symbolic role within these sacred walls. Fountains in cloisters were not merely utilitarian, but meditative, their steady trickle providing a gentle background for prayer and contemplation. For monks, water symbolized purity, renewal, and divine grace. To hear its flow was to be reminded of the living water promised in Scripture, a constant echo of spiritual truths woven into the very fabric of daily chores. In the silence of the cloister, the sound of water was as much a hymn as any chant sung in the choir. The construction and maintenance of monastic water systems required skill, organization, and labor. Lay brothers and hired workers often undertook the physical tasks, digging channels, lining cisterns, and repairing pipes. Over time, monasteries became centers of hydraulic knowledge, their innovations spreading to surrounding towns and villages. The techniques developed in these secluded places influenced urban water management, showing that faith and practicality could work hand in hand. In this sense, monasteries were not just spiritual refuges, but engines of progress, quietly shaping the world beyond their walls. Yet even these carefully planned systems were not immune to hardship. Droughts tested reserves, floods damaged channels, and sieges cut off access. In such times, monks shared the same vulnerability as townsfolk, relying on stored rainwater or reducing their consumption. But their discipline, organization, and foresight often gave them an advantage. The rule taught restraint and moderation, and in scarcity, these virtues became survival tools. While cities might panic in times of shortage, monasteries endured with calm, their routines adapting but never breaking. To walk through the ruins of a monastery today is to glimpse traces of this ingenuity. Channels carved into stone, troughs along cloisters, and remnants of mills and latrines tell a story of careful planning. These features are often overlooked by visitors drawn to churches and manuscripts, but they are just as revealing. They remind us that monks, though devoted to heaven, lived fully on earth, shaping their environment with thought and care. In their water systems, we see the harmony they sought, practical needs met with spiritual symbolism, daily labor transformed into devotion. In monasteries, water was not only sustenance, but discipline, order, and prayer. It cleansed hands before meals, brewed ale for guests, irrigated gardens, and whispered softly through cloisters as monks recited psalms. It was a constant presence, woven seamlessly into the rhythm of work and worship. By harnessing water with such care, monastic communities created a model of resilience that sustained them for centuries and left behind a legacy still visible in stone and memory today. Water was not only drawn, stored, and consumed. It was also harnessed as a force of power. In the medieval world, where muscle and animal labor were the primary engines of work, flowing water offered something remarkable: steady, tireless energy. Rivers and streams could be made to turn wheels, and those wheels could drive machines that ground grain, crushed ore, pressed cloth, and even sawed timber. The watermill, in its many forms, became one of the most important technologies of the Middle Ages, transforming water from a necessity of life into the beating heart of industry. The sight of a mill by a river was familiar across medieval Europe. A wooden wheel, its paddles dipping into the current, turned slowly and steadily as water pressed against it. This motion, simple yet powerful, was transferred by gears and shafts into grinding stones inside the mill house. The stones, massive and circular, rotated against one another, crushing kernels of grain into flour. For a society dependent on bread as its staple food, the mill was not just a convenience, but a cornerstone of survival. Every loaf eaten in town and village alike began with the turning of those stones, powered by the ceaseless flow of water. The earliest mills were simple, built where streams ran fast and steady. But over time, engineering grew more complex. Channels were cut to direct water with precision, sluice gates controlled flow, and overshot wheels, where water poured from above, captured even more energy than the simpler undershot wheels. Monasteries became leaders in mill construction, building elaborate systems that not only ground grain, but also powered workshops. In some places, entire complexes of mills lined riversides, each one devoted to a different trade, turning water into wealth. Beyond grinding grain, mills found endless uses. Fulling mills treated wool and cloth, pounding it with wooden hammers driven by water power to thicken and strengthen fabric. Iron mills used water wheels to operate bellows, feeding air into furnaces that smelted ore. Paper mills, arriving later in the Middle Ages, relied on water to pulp rags into fibers, fueling the spread of literacy and learning. In each case, the principle was the same: the steady force of water, captured and directed, multiplied human effort, and expanded what communities could produce. The economic importance of mills was immense. Lords and towns often claimed rights over mill sites, for whoever controlled the water controlled the work. In many regions, peasants were required to bring their grain to the lord's mill, paying a portion as a fee known as multure. This monopoly could be resented, but it ensured that mills remained sources of revenue and authority. Disputes over mill rights were common, reflecting just how central water power had become to daily life and prosperity. Mills also shaped the rhythm of communities. The sound of grinding stones, the splash of water against wheels, and the creak of wooden gears were constant in towns where mills operated. Farmers queued with sacks of grain, waiting their turn, while millers often viewed with a mix of respect and suspicion, measured flour, and took their due. The mill was a place of labor, transaction, and gossip, where the necessities of survival mingled with the pulse of local life. In literature and folklore, millers became stock characters, sometimes portrayed as clever tricksters who skimmed from the grain, other times as sturdy figures at the heart of the community. Yet mills were not without risk. The machinery was heavy, the stones dangerous, and accidents were not uncommon. Children and laborers who worked in mills sometimes lost fingers or worse, caught in the gears. Floods could sweep away entire structures, while droughts could halt them, silencing wheels and leaving communities short of flour. The reliance on water meant that mills shared the same vulnerability as the rivers that powered them, abundance one season, scarcity the next. Still, the ingenuity of medieval millwrights was remarkable. They learned to adapt wheels to the gentlest streams, to build dams and channels that regulated flow, and to design mechanisms that spread water power into multiple tasks at once. In some towns, mills stood as symbols of progress, their wheels turning ceaselessly as proof that human hands, guided by clever minds, could harness nature for survival. To see a mill wheel spinning was to see water's hidden strength revealed, transformed from a silent flow into a force that sustained entire communities. In the broader story of the Middle Ages, mills remind us that water was more than a drink or a bath. It was energy, industry, and innovation. It shaped economies, enriched lords, and supported the growth of towns. It turned rivers into workshops and made the simple act of flowing water into the heartbeat of industry. To hear the rumble of a millstone was to hear not only grain being ground, but the sound of a society moving forward, powered by the quiet but relentless strength of water. For all its blessings, water in the medieval city was never entirely safe. The very substance that sustained life could just as easily carry death. Without modern understanding of germs or sanitation, people lived in constant, if often unrecognized, contact with danger whenever they drew a bucket from a well, filled a jug at a fountain, or scooped from a river. To drink water was to take a chance, and yet it was unavoidable, for no household, rich or poor, could survive without it. Contamination was almost inevitable in crowded towns. Waste from homes, workshops, and animals found its way into the streets, where rain washed it downward into rivers and streams. Tanneries, dye houses, and butchers emptied their refuse into the same waters that others drew for cooking and drinking. In some cities, cesspits dug too close to wells leaked their contents into the soil, seeping into the very sources people relied upon. What looked clear and harmless in a jug might in fact carry invisible dangers that caused fevers, cramps, and sometimes death. The link between foul water and illness was not fully understood, but people noticed patterns. They knew that drinking from certain wells could bring sickness, while other sources seemed safer. They observed that outbreaks of dysentery or bloody flux often followed the use of polluted streams. When plagues swept through cities, rumors spread that poisoned wells were to blame, and suspicion often fell unjustly on outsiders or marginalized groups. Though science had not yet explained microbes, experience taught that not all water was equal, and communities took steps, sometimes effective, sometimes desperate, to guard against its dangers. Boiling water was one method, though fuel was expensive, and not every household could spare the wood. More common was the preference for beer and ale, which were safer to drink. Brewing required boiling, and the fermentation process created liquids less hospitable to disease. For this reason, even children often drank small ale, a weak form of beer, instead of plain water. In monasteries and towns alike, ale was not merely a drink of choice, but a strategy for survival, reducing reliance on uncertain water supplies. The popularity of wine in southern Europe served a similar purpose, for fermentation, too, offered protection. In times of epidemic, wells and fountains were often inspected, sometimes even blessed or purified by priests. Holy water and ritual were thought to drive away corruption, both spiritual and physical. In some towns, laws were passed forbidding the dumping of waste near water sources, though enforcement was uneven at best. Guilds, too, sometimes took responsibility, ensuring that their workshops did not foul the shared resources upon which all depended. Yet despite these measures, contamination remained a constant threat, woven into the very structure of medieval urban life. The fear of poisoned water played a role in warfare as well. Armies laying siege to cities sometimes sought to pollute wells, throwing in dead animals or other foul substances. Defenders knew that the loss of clean water could doom them faster than hunger. Chronicles tell of desperate measures taken to guard or conceal wells within castles, their locations kept secret to prevent enemy sabotage. In such times, the fragile line between life and disease was starkly visible, and water became both a weapon and a vulnerability. Religion, too, shaped how people understood waterborne illness. When sickness followed the use of a well, some believed it was punishment for sin or a test of faith. Pilgrims sought healing at sacred springs, convinced that holy waters could wash away disease where ordinary sources could not. Priests sprinkled holy water to purify homes, and processions were held to pray for relief from plagues. Though these acts did little to prevent contamination, they offered comfort, giving meaning to suffering and hope to those caught in cycles of sickness. The social impact of waterborne disease was profound. Outbreaks struck hardest among the poor, who had fewer options for avoiding polluted sources. Wealthier households could afford cisterns, barrels, or regular deliveries from trusted water carriers. The poor, forced to draw from rivers and crowded wells, bore the brunt of illness. In this way, access to cleaner water became yet another divide between rich and poor, shaping not only daily comfort, but survival itself. The suffering of the poor often went unrecorded, yet their struggles with contaminated water were among the most constant and devastating realities of medieval life. Still, resilience was strong. People learned to adapt, to seek safer sources, to share knowledge about which fountains ran clear and which brought harm. Communities developed rules, customs, and habits that, while not always effective by modern standards, represented sincere attempts to live with the dangers they faced. To live in a medieval city was to know that water was never simple, never wholly safe, but always indispensable. Every bucket carried home was both a gift and a gamble, a reminder of how thin the line between health and sickness could be. To reflect on water and disease in the Middle Ages is to see the precarious balance of life in that era. It shows us that behind the bustle of markets and the grandeur of cathedrals lay a daily struggle against unseen forces carried in every drop. Water, clear and sparkling in a bucket, could refresh or destroy. And yet people endured, shaping customs, rituals, and resilience around the hidden dangers of contamination. In their persistence, we glimpse both the fragility and the strength of medieval life, a reminder that even in the face of unseen threats, humanity continued to draw, to drink, and to survive. Water was always precious in medieval cities, but its value became most visible in times of scarcity. Drought, when the skies withheld rain for weeks or months, and siege, when armies surrounded a town and cut off supplies, exposed just how fragile the balance of survival could be. In these moments, every drop mattered, and the strategies communities used to endure reveal much about their resilience, their fears, and their faith. When drought struck, the effects rippled across every aspect of life. Wells that once gave freely began to yield only trickles, their buckets scraping mud instead of filling with clear water. Public fountains, once lively gathering places, grew silent as their spouts ran dry. Rivers shrank to narrow streams, exposing stones and muddy banks. Farmers watched their fields wither, their crops yellowing for lack of irrigation, while animals suffered under the same thirst as their owners. The rhythm of daily life slowed under the weight of scarcity, for each task that relied on water became heavier, harder, and more uncertain. Households adapted in small but significant ways. Rainwater barrels, often neglected in times of abundance, became essential lifelines, guarded carefully against waste. Families rationed what they had, using the smallest amounts possible for cooking and drinking while foregoing baths and washing. Neighbors sometimes pooled their resources, sharing from one household cistern when another had none. Yet these acts of cooperation could just as easily turn into conflict, as scarcity bred suspicion and disputes. Who had drawn too much? Who had failed to share? Quarrels at wells and fountains became sharper, and in some places, violence broke out over access to dwindling supplies. Religious responses were also common. Processions carried relics through parched streets, prayers rose in churches, and clergy called on God to send rain. In many towns, drought was interpreted as divine punishment for sin, and communities turned to fasting, almsgiving, and penitence in hopes of mercy. Pilgrimages to holy wells or springs were organized, seeking intercession from saints thought to have power over the heavens. These spiritual practices did not bring immediate relief, but they provided meaning and unity in the face of suffering, giving people a framework to endure what otherwise seemed arbitrary and cruel. If drought strained patience, siege tested survival in even harsher ways. When an enemy encircled a city, one of the first strategies was often to cut off its water. Aqueducts could be broken, rivers diverted, and wells poisoned. The defenders, trapped within their walls, suddenly found themselves facing thirst as great as the threat of swords. Chronicles tell of cities where residents drank from muddy ditches, collected dew from leaves, or even resorted to boiling leather and soaking grain husks for moisture. In these desperate moments, the line between survival and despair grew thin. Castles and fortified towns prepared for this possibility by building cisterns, digging hidden wells, or creating secret passages to rivers outside the walls. Some stored vast reserves of water in barrels, hoping they would last through the long wait of a blockade. Still, even the best preparations could falter if the siege stretched on. Water turned stale, cisterns ran low, and disease spread more easily in the crowded, thirsty conditions of a besieged population. To surrender often became less a matter of lost battles than of empty cisterns, the decision forced by the silence of dry wells rather than the clamor of enemy arms. Scarcity reshaped society in visible ways. Prices for water soared, and those with the means could pay carriers or buy access, while the poor suffered most acutely. Inequality, always present, grew sharper in droughts and sieges, with the powerful hoarding what they could. Yet stories also survive of generosity, of families who shared their last stores, of communities that united in rationing. These moments remind us that scarcity could reveal both the harshest and the noblest sides of human nature. The memory of droughts and sieges lingered long after they ended. Cities rebuilt their water systems with greater care, digging deeper wells, expanding cisterns, and investing in conduits that could not be easily severed. Chronicles recorded the hardships, ensuring that future generations remembered the lessons of scarcity. In this way, the trials of drought and siege shaped not only immediate survival, but long-term innovation, driving communities to think more carefully about how they secured and preserved water. To live in a medieval city was to know that water was never guaranteed. Abundance could give way to scarcity in an instant, and the strategies of endurance, whether rationing, praying, or building stronger systems, were part of the rhythm of life. In every dry well and empty fountain, people were reminded of their dependence on forces larger than themselves, on nature, on God, on the fragile structures of stone and wood that carried water into their homes. Scarcity was a teacher, harsh and unrelenting, but it left behind resilience, a hard-earned wisdom carried forward into the centuries. In times of drought or siege, when thirst pressed hardest, water became more than a necessity. It became a symbol of hope, of endurance, and of the will to survive. Each drop drawn, each barrel guarded, each prayer whispered was a reminder that life clung stubbornly to the promise of water, waiting for rain, for relief, for the moment when abundance would return and the fountains would flow once more. For medieval people, water was never just a physical necessity. It carried deep symbolic weight, shaping their spiritual imagination as much as their daily routines. To drink, to bathe, to wash, these acts were not only practical, but also infused with meaning. In every drop, they saw reminders of purity, renewal, danger, and divine power. To understand the Middle Ages, we must look at how water flowed not only through wells, fountains, and rivers, but also through faith, art, and thought. At the heart of Christian life stood baptism, the ritual that marked a soul's entrance into the faith. To be immersed in water, or to have it poured over the head, was to be cleansed of sin and born anew. Baptismal fonts stood at the entrances of churches, their waters consecrated and sacred. For parents, bringing an infant to the font was not simply a custom but a necessity, for without it, the child's soul was thought to remain vulnerable. Thus, water at baptism carried more than physical weight. It carried eternity, its drops believed to wash the soul as surely as they touched the skin. Beyond baptism, holy water was a constant presence. Priests sprinkled it on congregations during Mass, blessed homes and fields with it, and used it in rites meant to ward off evil. To carry a vial of holy water, or to keep some at the door of a house, was to invite divine protection into daily life. In this way, ordinary water, once blessed, became a spiritual shield, its symbolic power exceeding its physical form. The faithful treated it with reverence, seeing in it the touch of the sacred hidden within the ordinary. Water also played a role in pilgrimage and healing. Holy springs, often associated with saints, drew travelers from across regions. Pilgrims knelt to drink, to bathe, or to wash their wounds in the hope of miraculous cures. Some springs were said to heal blindness, others to ease fevers or lameness. The water itself was not always different from any other, but belief gave it power, and the act of seeking it was a testament to faith. These holy sites, marked by chapels or crosses, became centers of devotion, where the natural and the supernatural met in a single flowing stream. In monastic life, water took on symbolic roles as well. Cloister fountains provided more than convenience. They created an atmosphere of contemplation. The sound of water trickling through stone basins reminded monks of the eternal flow of divine grace. In illuminated manuscripts, artists painted rivers of paradise, fountains of life, and saints standing by springs, weaving water into the visual language of devotion. For monks, water was not only an element to be managed, but a mirror of spiritual truths, a reminder that purity of soul was as vital as purity of body. Medieval literature echoed these themes. In romances and legends, enchanted springs appeared as tests or turning points, places where knights encountered visions or challenges. Rivers marked boundaries between worlds, thresholds to be crossed with courage. Wells were often portrayed as mysterious, their depths hiding secrets or treasures. Water in stories was rarely neutral. It was alive, symbolic, and filled with meaning. Whether it nourished heroes or threatened them, it carried the weight of mystery, its flow echoing both life and the unknown. At the same time, water could symbolize danger and chaos. Floods were seen as signs of divine wrath, echoes of the biblical deluge. Droughts were punishments, rivers turned red with blood in tales of apocalypse. To medieval eyes, water reflected God's will. It could bless or destroy, cleanse or drown, heal or corrupt. This duality gave it a place of awe in the imagination, for it was never wholly safe, never wholly tame. Its very unpredictability mirrored the uncertainty of human life, where fortune could turn as swiftly as a stream changed its course. Everyday practices carried symbolic echoes as well. Washing before meals was not only hygienic, but a ritual of preparation, a gesture of respect for the food and company. The blessing of wells or rivers linked the act of drawing water to divine favor. Even the simple act of quenching thirst could be framed in sermons as a reminder of the soul as deeper thirst for God. In this way, the symbolic meaning of water was never far from ordinary life, woven into gestures and rituals so familiar they became second nature. Art and architecture reinforced these ideas. Fountains in city squares often bore carvings of lions, saints, or angels, turning utilitarian structures into symbols of protection and grace. Church carvings depicted rivers flowing from paradise, while stained glass windows glowed with images of baptism and holy springs. In gardens, water features symbolized abundance and renewal, small reflections of the eternal paradise promised in faith. The physical presence of water in these spaces reminded medieval people that the sacred was not distant, but present in every drop. Ultimately, water in the medieval imagination was a bridge between the earthly and the divine. It sustained crops and quenched thirst, but it also cleansed souls and healed hearts. It was both fragile and powerful, ordinary and miraculous. For those who lived in a world of uncertainty, where death and hardship were constant companions, water offered reassurance. It was life, renewal, and grace flowing ceaselessly through the world, a reminder that beneath the struggles of each day lay the promise of something greater. In this way, water was more than a resource, it was a language. It spoke of purity, danger, hope, and faith. It whispered in fountains, roared in rivers, shimmered in holy springs, and glistened in baptismal fonts. To medieval people, it was both sustenance and symbol, a daily necessity and a timeless mystery. In every sense, it was the element that bound body and soul, earth and heaven, in one unending flow. Medieval cities did not remain static in their relationship with water. Over the centuries, necessity and ingenuity pushed communities to adapt, experiment, and improve. From the humblest wooden pipes to grand aqueducts and subterranean conduits, innovations in water supply transformed the way people lived in urban centers. These changes were rarely sudden, but rather slow accumulations of knowledge, shaped by trial, error, and the relentless demand of growing populations. In these quiet advances, we can trace the story of how medieval life edged closer to the systems we recognize today. One of the earliest and most widespread innovations was the development of conduits networks of pipes that brought water directly from springs into towns. Unlike the open channels of antiquity, medieval conduits were often buried underground, protecting the water from contamination and keeping it cool. Made from hollowed tree trunks, clay, or sometimes lead, these pipes carried water across miles, feeding public fountains, cisterns, and reservoirs. In London, Paris, and other great cities, conduits became essential arteries, allowing urban centers to grow beyond the limits of local wells. Though primitive by modern standards, they represented a profound leap forward, bringing water into the heart of the city with greater efficiency. Storage was another key innovation. Cisterns, both public and private, multiplied across medieval towns. Large underground chambers collected water from rain, springs, or conduits, holding reserves that could sustain communities through droughts or sieges. These cisterns were lined with stone or brick, sealed with mortar to prevent leaks, and often carefully maintained by appointed officials. Their presence gave households and neighborhoods a measure of security, reducing dependence on daily fetching. In castles and monasteries, vast cisterns became lifelines, demonstrating how foresight in water storage could mean survival in times of crisis. The regulation of water also grew more sophisticated. Cities appointed officials sometimes called conduit wardens or fountain keepers to oversee the maintenance of systems, ensuring that water flowed where it was needed and remained unpolluted. Ordinances were passed restricting waste disposal near water sources, and fines were imposed on those who fouled public supplies. These rules, while imperfectly enforced, reflected an emerging awareness that water was not just a personal resource, but a communal trust. To protect, it was to protect the health and stability of the entire city. Public fountains themselves became more advanced. No longer simple spouts or basins, they were often designed with multiple outlets to serve larger crowds, sometimes connected to elaborate reservoirs beneath the streets. Decorative elements blended utility with civic pride, turning fountains into both practical centers and symbols of urban identity. Innovations in hydraulics allowed water to be raised slightly above natural levels, creating jets or flowing features that added beauty to public squares. These refinements showed that water was not only essential, but also something to be celebrated, a mark of prosperity and order. Guilds and industries also contributed to innovation. Brewers, tanners, and dyers all required reliable supplies, and their pressure often spurred the creation or expansion of conduits. In some towns, industries were assigned specific outlets or channels, preventing them from drawing directly from public fountains. This separation, while not always perfect, represented an early effort to balance domestic needs with commercial demands. The interplay between industry and household use shaped water systems in ways that echoed into later centuries, laying the groundwork for the more complex networks of early modern cities. Technology, too, advanced in subtle ways. Improved pumps, operated by hand or by animal power, allowed water to be lifted from deeper wells or directed into higher places. Archimedean screws and piston pumps, though rare, appeared in some regions, reflecting the gradual spread of ancient knowledge into medieval practice. Water wheels, while primarily used for mills, occasionally powered lifting devices that helped move water into elevated cisterns. These tools, though limited, hinted at the mechanical innovations that would later revolutionize urban water supply. Even in households, small innovations mattered. Rainwater collection systems grew more refined, with better gutters, spouts, and barrels. Clay filters, sand basins, and cloth sieves were used to improve the quality of stored water. Families devised methods for keeping barrels cool and covered, reducing spoilage. These minor adjustments, repeated across thousands of homes, collectively improved the daily experience of water use, easing burdens and reducing risks. The spread of these innovations was uneven. Wealthier cities with strong governance and resources advanced more quickly, while smaller towns often relied on older methods. Geography, too, played a role. Cities near abundant rivers had less incentive to build complex systems, while those in drier regions invested heavily in conduits and cisterns. Yet wherever populations pressed against the limits of supply, creativity emerged. Necessity, as always, proved the mother of invention. Perhaps the greatest innovation was not technical, but organizational. The recognition that water was a shared resource requiring collective management. Councils, guilds, and communities took responsibility for maintaining fountains, cleaning conduits, and funding repairs. The idea that water systems needed oversight, regulation, and public investment was a profound shift from reliance on private wells or individual effort. It was a step toward the modern understanding of infrastructure as a common good, sustained by cooperation and governance. To trace these innovations is to see medieval people not as passive victims of scarcity, but as active problem solvers. They dug, built, repaired, and regulated, always seeking to make the flow of water more secure. Their solutions were often imperfect, fragile, and vulnerable to disruption, yet they reveal a determination to adapt. In every conduit laid, every cistern sealed, every fountain improved, we glimpse the ingenuity of a society striving to meet its most basic need with creativity and persistence. In the trickle of a medieval fountain or the darkness of an underground conduit, there is a story of progress quiet, slow, but steady. It is a story that reminds us that innovation is not always dramatic, but often the accumulation of small, careful steps taken by ordinary hands. Through these innovations, medieval cities laid the foundation for the systems that still sustain us today. Water was essential everywhere in the medieval world, but the ways it was gathered, used, and valued varied greatly between rural villages and bustling cities. The contrast between countryside and town reveals not only differences in access and technology, but also in rhythm, culture, and community. To compare rural and urban practices is to see two worlds shaped by the leaf. Same need, yet responding in ways as distinct as the landscapes they inhabited. In rural villages, water was often closer to hand, yet still required effort. Wells were common, dug near clusters of homes, their buckets and ropes shared by neighbors. Streams and springs provided additional sources, and fields were watered directly by rainfall or simple irrigation ditches cut by farmers. Life in the countryside was deeply tied to the seasons, and water use reflected this rhythm. In spring, snowmelt filled rivers and streams, bringing abundance for planting. In summer, drought could wither crops, and villagers relied heavily on stored rainwater or deep wells. In winter, ice and snow presented their own challenges, requiring people to break frozen surfaces or melt snow for daily use. For rural people, water was inseparable from the land, its flow dictating the success of harvests and the survival of livestock. Cities, by contrast, faced density and demand. A single well or stream could not serve thousands of inhabitants, and so urban water practices became more complex. Fountains, conduits, cisterns, and water carriers emerged as solutions, layering technology and labor to meet the needs of crowded populations. In towns, water was not just drawn but managed, regulated, and distributed, often with rules and officials overseeing its flow. Where villagers walked to a stream, city dwellers lined up at fountains. Where farmers irrigated fields, urban bakers and brewers demanded steady supplies for their trades. The complexity of city life magnified the challenges of water, making it as much a matter of governance as of geography. Social differences also shaped water practices. In rural areas, wells and streams were often communal, shared without strict regulation, beyond custom and tradition. Neighbors relied on one another, and disputes were settled within small communities where everyone knew each other. In cities, however, water was stratified by wealth and influence. The rich could pay for water carriers, build private cisterns, or secure access to conduits, while the poor crowded at public fountains or drew from rivers prone to pollution. Scarcity sharpened inequality, and the daily act of fetching water revealed social divisions as starkly as clothing or housing. Technology, too, showed contrasts. Rural people used simpler tools, buckets, troughs, and channels carved into earth, while cities developed underground conduits, aqueducts, and pumps. Yet rural communities were not without ingenuity. Farmers learned to divert streams with sluices, to dig ditches that spread water across fields, and to maintain ponds that served as reserves for both livestock and irrigation. These techniques, though modest compared to urban systems, reflected a close relationship with the land, a knowledge of terrain and season that was no less skilled than the stonework of urban fountains. The uses of water also diverged. In villages, water was primarily for survival, drinking, cooking, cleaning, and sustaining fields and animals. In towns, its uses expanded into industry and commerce. Tanners, dyers, fullers, and brewers demanded enormous amounts, sometimes diverting supplies that might otherwise serve households. Mills, powered by water, clustered along urban rivers, feeding bread to entire populations. Thus, in cities, water was not only life but livelihood, fueling trades and shaping economies. In rural areas, it remained closer to its natural rhythms, tied directly to the cycles of farming and domestic life. Cultural attitudes reflected these differences. Villagers often viewed springs and streams with reverence, weaving them into local folklore and treating them as communal blessings. Sacred wells dotted the countryside, associated with saints or legends, drawing pilgrims and locals alike. In towns, the symbolic weight of water was present too, but it often attached itself to fountains and conduits, where civic pride and religious ritual mingled. Urban water carried the marks of human ingenuity and governance, while rural water retained its closeness to the land and its mysteries. Scarcity revealed the contrasts most starkly. In drought, rural communities suffered crop failures, hunger, and hardship, but they could sometimes rely on smaller populations and closer-knit ties to endure together. In cities, scarcity meant crowded fountains, rising prices, and outbreaks of disease, as too many people pressed upon too few sources. Siege, of course, was a uniquely urban problem, for villages were rarely targeted in the same way. The strategies of storage and defense that sustained castles and towns were largely unnecessary in rural settings, where mobility and dispersal were more common responses to hardship. Despite these differences, connections bound countryside and city. Urban water systems often depended on rural sources, springs in distant hills, rivers flowing through farmland, or aqueducts cutting across fields. Villagers sometimes bore the burden of maintaining or protecting these supplies, their labor supporting the thirst of towns. In return, cities provided markets, monasteries, and authorities that influenced rural water practices in subtle ways. The relationship was not equal, but it was interdependent, linking both worlds through the flow of water. To compare rural and urban practices is to see two responses to the same challenge, each shaped by context. The village relied on proximity to the land, communal traditions, and seasonal rhythms. The city relied on technology, organization, and hierarchy. Both endured hardships, both devised solutions, and both reveal the adaptability of medieval people in the face of unending need. Together, they show us that water was not only a physical resource, but a mirror of society itself, reflecting how people lived, worked, and believed in every setting, from the quietest hamlet to the busiest square. In the end, whether drawn from a village spring or poured from a city fountain, water bound medieval people together. It shaped their days, their economies, their faith, and their futures. It was both universal and particular, the same element carried in buckets across muddy lanes or channeled through stone into crowded streets. By comparing rural and urban practices, we glimpse the diversity of medieval life, yet also its unity, for all were sustained by the same clear, flowing lifeblood. The ways medieval people secured, stored, and shared water did not vanish with their era. Though centuries have passed, their ingenuity and struggles left a legacy that shaped the systems we rely upon today. Every well dug, every fountain built, every conduit laid beneath cobblestones was a step toward the more complex infrastructures that sustain modern cities. To reflect on this legacy is to see how the daily labors of countless hands flowed forward through time, carrying lessons, practices, and innovations into the future. Wells were among the oldest and most enduring of these legacies. The simple act of drawing water from the earth continued long after medieval walls crumbled. In rural communities, wells remained the lifeblood of daily life well into the modern period. And even today, in many parts of the world, they serve as vital sources of clean water. The techniques refined in the Middle Ages lining wells with stone, protecting them from contamination, maintaining ropes and pulleys were passed down through generations, their usefulness unchanged by the march of history. Cisterns and rainwater harvesting also endured. The practice of storing water against scarcity continued to influence household and civic planning. In regions prone to drought, medieval methods of collecting and preserving rainwater informed later approaches, from Renaissance palaces to early modern towns. The idea that water could be managed, saved, and rationed became a permanent part of human strategy, reminding us that resourcefulness in times of want often leaves the deepest marks on memory. Aqueducts and conduits, though primitive by today's standards, laid the groundwork for urban plumbing. The medieval choice to bury pipes, to regulate their maintenance, and to fund them through taxes or civic contributions foreshadowed modern municipal water systems. The officials appointed to oversee conduits were foreigners of today's public works departments, charged with ensuring that water flowed cleanly and reliably. Their work, often invisible but essential, carried forward into the principles of governance that underpin modern infrastructure. That water, though drawn from nature, becomes a collective responsibility when shared by a city. Bathhouses, fountains, and mills also left their marks. Public bathing declined after the Middle Ages, but the cultural memory of shared water spaces influenced later urban planning, from Renaissance bath complexes to modern spas. Fountains evolved from medieval gathering points into symbols of civic pride in later centuries, their decorative forms growing ever more elaborate. But their roots remained in the simple necessity of bringing water to the people. Mills, powered by water, were precursors to industrialization, showing how natural forces could be harnessed to multiply labor. The leap from grinding grain to driving machinery was one of continuity, a story of water's power slowly guiding humanity toward greater technological horizons. The management of disease, too, was shaped by medieval experiences. Though people in the Middle Ages did not understand germs, their struggles with contaminated wells and fouled rivers taught hard lessons about the importance of sanitation. Ordinances against waste near water sources, the inspection of wells, and the gradual realization that cleaner water meant healthier communities all laid foundations for public health reforms centuries later. The great sanitary movements of the 19th century, with their sewers and treatment plants, were distant heirs to the medieval recognition that water carried both life and death. Symbolically, water's role in faith and imagination continued to flow forward. Baptism remained central to Christian life, and the reverence for holy springs endured in pilgrimage traditions. The imagery of fountains of life, rivers of paradise, and cleansing waters continued to inspire art and literature, echoing medieval themes in new forms. Even as societies modernized, water retained its spiritual resonance, reminding people that it was more than a commodity. It was a mystery, a symbol, a source of renewal. The legacy of medieval water systems is not only technical but human. It lies in the resilience of those who carried buckets daily, the endurance of water carriers, trudging through narrow lanes, the foresight of builders who carved cisterns beneath monasteries, and the determination of city councils, who taxed themselves to repair conduits. Their lives, though far removed from ours, shaped the path that led to modern taps and faucets. The ease with which we turn a handle today is built upon centuries of effort, ingenuity, and struggle. To walk through an old European city today is to see echoes of this legacy everywhere. Wells still stand in squares, their stones worn smooth by centuries of hands. Fountains continue to pour in plazas, fed now by hidden pipes, but rooted in the same tradition of public gathering. Rivers flow past ancient bridges, their currents once turned to mills, now reflecting streetlights. Beneath the pavement, some medieval conduits remain, forgotten, but still carrying water as they have for hundreds of years. The past, in this way, is not gone but flows quietly beneath our feet, sustaining us still. The long legacy of medieval water systems reminds us that history is not only measured in battles and kings, but in the humble, persistent work of survival. It is measured in the buckets carried, the wells dug, the cisterns filled, and the fountains tended. These quiet acts, repeated endlessly across centuries, shape the world as surely as cathedrals or castles. They teach us that the foundations of our modern comfort lie not only in great inventions, but in countless small labors, each drop building upon the last. In the story of water, we see the story of humanity itself, fragile, inventive, enduring. From medieval wells to modern taps, the flow has never ceased. It carries with it the memory of a world where every drop mattered, where communities gathered around fountains and prayed for rain, where water was both a challenge and a blessing. That legacy lives on, reminding us to cherish what we have, to respect the sources that sustain us, and to remember the countless lives that shape the flow of history, one bucket at a time. As we have seen, water shaped every corner of medieval life, from the humble wells at the heart of villages to the grand conduits that fed fountains in the largest cities, from the quiet trickle of cloister fountains to the roar of rivers turning mill wheels. Water was the lifeblood that sustained people in both body and spirit. It was carried on weary shoulders, stored in dark cisterns, blessed in churches, and feared when fouled. It was blessing and burden, necessity and symbol. Always present, always needed, always shaping the rhythms of survival. The ingenuity of medieval communities, reminds us that history is not only about kings, wars, and monuments, but also about the endless labor of ordinary people. It is about the women drawing buckets each morning, the carriers trudging through muddy streets, the monks planning their channels, and the millers listening to the steady rumble of stones. Their quiet perseverance kept cities alive. Their innovations laid foundations for our modern world, and their reverence for water shaped traditions that still endure. Behind every drop was a story of endurance, resilience, and hope. Tonight, as you let yourself drift towards sleep, imagine the sound of water echoing through those old streets, the creak of a pulley, the splash of a fountain, the murmur of a river beneath a stone bridge. Let it carry you back to a time when each drop was precious, when life was measured in buckets drawn and wells kept full. And let it remind you of the long chain of human history, where the struggles and triumphs of the past still ripple quietly into the present. Before you go, I invite you to subscribe to *History for Sleep*, where we bring you calm journeys into the past, perfect for unwinding and resting. Share in the comments what moments of history you'd like to hear next, and let us know when you listen, whether in the quiet hours of night or the still moments of the day. Your thoughts guide these stories, helping us explore the past together. For now, close your eyes, slow your breathing, and let the steady flow of history carry you gently toward rest. Just as water sustained the medieval city, may these stories sustain your peace tonight. Sleep well, and until next time, may the echoes of the past bring you calm and comfort.